Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, Andrés Manuel López Obrador represents the beginning of a new era in Mexico and in the Americas. Our guest, Eric Hershberg, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at American University. Eric Hershberg, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Eric, what is the significance, the historic significance for Mexico, the arrival of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, as they call it, in the life of that country as a president?
Well, AMLO himself sometimes situates his victory as portending a fourth transformation of Mexico, going back to the first being independence. I don't think that it is necessarily on that scale of grandeur, but it is nonetheless a very important change for Mexico. This is the first time that a party other than the PRI or the PAN will have the Mexican presidency in a century. And it is the first time that someone running on a platform of fundamental change, of redistribution, and of overcoming corruption wins the presidential office with a large majority and immediately puts forth a set of proposals that are quite radical. Symbolically and potentially in practice. And so it is a very important moment of change in Mexico.
Juan Carlos Monedero, which is the founder of the political party in Spain, Podemos, I did have the opportunity to talk to him, and he said, careful, AMLO has won the government, but he hasn't won the power. In that sense, he says the power is still with the media, with the banking, with the corporations, with the narco-trafficking. Is he right?
Well, power in any society, in any modern society, is diffuse. It's located in many different places. Monedero is right that there are many, what we would call in Spanish, poderes fácticos, these kind of entrenched powers, often authoritarian concentrations of power in Mexican society. But it is also the case that the President of Mexico is a very powerful office. And this is a President of Mexico who also has a majority in Congress. And he also has a great deal of influence over quite a number of the governors. And he has a great deal of support from the population. So this is not a man who comes to office without power. Having said that, he is going to need to retain confidence of both domestic and external private investors. Mexico cannot advance economically, and his constituency cannot see their life chances improved if there is a sharp curtailment in investment capital in Mexico. He is going to need to confront networks of corruption, networks of organized crime, and the violence that results from those. These are very important challenges, and these are not things that he is going to be able to do from one day to the next. And I fear that he's not going to be able to do them if he doesn't make some daring steps that he doesn't appear inclined to make to generate greater resources that the Mexican state could allocate to social and economic needs in Mexico.
There are a lot of people who believe that he's playing with fire because he has already said we are going to end up corruption. It's going to be the end of privatizations. Do you think that it's possible that he's going to be killed physically or he's going to be strangled in, could be economically way or in a different way in order to stop because he's dealing with a big fish?
Well, there's certainly a lot of entrenched interests in Mexico who will do what they can to frustrate this government and to impede its abilities to reorganize power inside Mexico. I would point out, López Obrador himself has a long history of governing in Mexico. He governed very effectively, and he governed in alliance with all kinds of sectors when he was the mayor of Mexico City. And his campaign coalition includes people from all kinds of sectors, including pretty far on the right-hand side of the spectrum. And it's not clear that there can't be accommodations with many of the entrenched interests that some of AMLO's most enthusiastic supporters are assuming he will run up against. The question, I think, really is what kinds of alliances he will build and what kinds of resources he will be able to allocate in what directions, and also what kinds of compromises he's going to make. And as he makes compromises, which he inevitably will do, will that undermine the support that he has received from such a broad cross-section of Mexican society? Or will it be that the advances that he makes, many of which are going to be symbolic, that the advances that he makes are sufficient for him to sustain public support for the vision of reform that he embodies?
In previous day, his designated foreign minister, it's called Marcelo Ebrard, has already met with his counterpart here, Mike Pompeo, and also the day after with Kristen Nielsen, that is a Home Security Director. And migration was one of the subjects in the discussions. What do you think that is going to happen in that area?
Well, I think migration is potentially a grave source of tension between López Obrador's administration and his counterparts in Washington. You can't frame this issue without understanding the fundamental motivating factor of the White House and key cabinet agencies, the leadership in key cabinet agencies, of using migration as a political wedge issue, mobilizing often racist resentments against immigrants, against non-white immigrants. Remember, this is the president who commented, "Why don't they send me immigrants from Norway," right? And the intent to make a political wedge issue of a racialized migration crisis is something that is always going to be present either above or just beneath the surface with this administration. And given that we have tens of thousands of Central Americans being pushed out of the region and flowing through Mexico to either settle in Mexico or do what they want to do and get to the United States, given that, and given the desire of the United States government to push the Mexican government to make sure that those people cannot get to the border, cannot have their cases for their requests for asylum heard in the American judicial system. In that context, Mexico is going to be under a great deal of pressure to figure out ways to incorporate an increasingly large population. And Mexico has not yet made the investments that it's going to have to make in expanding its capacity to adjudicate asylum claims and to award larger numbers of humanitarian visas, which it has begun to give to Central Americans who are deciding that for now, at least, it is too difficult to get their rights to a hearing in a U.S. immigration court respected.
In recent days, they signed a new free trade agreement, if you want, NAFTA 2.0, yes. And what that represents for the migration issue and for the trade issue.
I don't think that the NAFTA 2.0, the new NAFTA, as Prime Minister Trudeau called it, much to the Trump administration's consternation, I don't think that not quite as good as the first one, NAFTA, is going to have a great impact on migration. I think the question is what impact it has on investment in Mexico. And this is something that I think worries the new administration in Mexico City, particularly because of the fact that the Congresses, and particularly the United States Congress, has not approved this new treaty. And the López Obrador's team very much wanted the previous administration of Enrique Peña Nieto to finish this negotiation so that it would not have to deal with it. Regrettably, because the Congress was not able to vote on that here in the United States, it was delayed to such a degree, that it's now going to need to be ratified in a new Congress that is much less likely to ratify it, where you have sectors of both the Democratic and the Republican parties that are going to attempt to chip away at it. And so it may very well be that the first issue on the trade agenda for López Obrador is the renegotiation of what had been negotiated by his predecessor.
In terms of challenges, migration, trade, and investment, the relationship between countries.
In terms of the relationship between the two countries, I think those are the fundamental ones. We didn't mention an aspect of migration that in the longer run I think is fundamental, though I don't think it's going to be at the top of the news agenda immediately. Goes back to the question of the treatment of millions of Mexican citizens who live in the United States with and without documentation. Amidst all of the vivid images that we're seeing of Central American migrants at the border, and all of the inflated rhetoric that we're seeing from Washington about invasions and the like. It's obscuring the ongoing uncertainties about the fortunes of the many millions of Mexican citizens who are living here and who suffer the consequences of an antiquated and often hostile immigration system that the Republican Party has for many years resisted reforming.
If the arrival to the presidency of Mexico of Andrés Manuel López Obrador represents a new era, for example, and here's my question, to the progressive governments and progressive movements in Latin America?
My sense is that AMLO, as we call López Obrador, my sense is that he is unlikely to try to project his brand of reformist politics beyond Mexico. This is unlike some of the more charismatic leaders of the left of the last couple of decades, in South America in particular, who aspired to a projection elsewhere in the region and to a kind of a collective projection of Latin America onto the international arena. I think that he's very focused on the needs for radical reform inside Mexico, that the problems of corruption, the problems of entrenched power, and the problems of social exclusion in Mexico are so fundamentally motivating what he's doing that I think that's where he's going to focus. It's also the case that he comes to office at a time when there are not a lot of counterparts in South America who are progressive leaders feeling confident, feeling in positions of strength with whom he could try to forge alliances. So I think the principal thing that we will see from the López Obrador administration is a return to a really 20th century Mexican approach to foreign relations. Which was non-intervention. And so I think that we will see a greater disinclination of Mexico to sign on to the initiatives of some Latin American governments, and certainly the United States, to pressure governments where they want to see important shifts in domestic political dynamics, beginning with Venezuela. And I think that López Obrador is less likely to be on board with some of the bilateral and multilateral efforts to pressure the Venezuelan government.
We were witnessing here at the OAS the Mexican representative leading the effort of what they call the Lima Group in order to try to oust the government of Venezuela. Most definitely doing it very actively, very systematically. Do you think that that eventually could be changed with AMLO?
I don't have any particular insight on what the dynamic was at the OAS around those questions, around the Venezuela question, and Mexico's engagement with it around the Venezuela question. But I think as a general rule, Mexico is less likely to favor bilateral or multilateral initiatives designed to orient the course of events inside the kind of domestic politics inside Latin American countries. And that is likely, I think, to extend to the OAS around the Venezuela question. One of the things that I think will be interesting to see is whether Mexico, under López Obrador, treats any differently OAS efforts to address problems of corruption impunity in member countries. Because one of the things that we saw with the OAS-sponsored Mission Against Corruption and Impunity in Honduras was that Mexico was among the countries that at times was trying to scale back the mandate of that initiative, thus helping to protect the entrenched groups in power in Honduras that rely on impunity in order to remain in power. To the extent that Mexico was doing that because it did not want there to be a successful precedent of international engagement with domestic anti-impunity efforts, perhaps López Obrador, who is apparently committed to striking out against corruption and impunity in Mexico, will be more open to international support for that and to cooperating with the international community when it seeks to assist domestic actors in countries like Honduras.
You were mentioning that he is going to concentrate mostly in domestic issues.
Yes.
And in a way, Central America is almost a domestic issue because of the geographical proximity to his country, and also because of the problems that are coming from there. And you have said regarding migrants, there's a chronic situation of expulsion in those countries. What do you mean?
Well, what I'm talking about is primarily Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where you have circumstances where the levels of impunity of rapacious elites who have concentrated economic resources, who have used the state to accumulate greater and disproportionate resources, and have been unwilling to invest in basic public goods like security, education, health for the population, and instead, with the resources that they concentrated, have purchased it for themselves at the expense of all of their fellow citizens. I think that the level of impunity of those groups in Central America has reached a point where vast segments of the population simply have no alternative but to migrate. They, in effect, do not have the right not to migrate. And until that circumstance of abuse of concentrated power is overcome, you will continue to see tens, even hundreds of thousands of Central Americans flee, initially trying to go to the United States, where they have family members, where they think there may be opportunities. But increasingly, as is already becoming clear and has been over the last, more than the last year or two, but it's becoming increasingly urgently clear in Mexico, important parts of those populations will settle for a significant amount of time, if not permanently, inside Mexico. And so López Obrador knows this, and López Obrador and his team are aware that they're going to have to manage a significant flow of very needy people that can be a humanitarian crisis that Mexico inevitably will be part of. And given that tens of thousands of people are going to remain in Mexico, they need to create employment for those people. They need to figure out ways to get those people's children into schools, et cetera, housing, health access. And so this is going to be an important challenge for the Mexican government, and I think it's why the Foreign Secretary was saying during his visit here in Washington in the earlier days that Ebrard was saying that there's a need for a $20 billion investment in what he referred to as a Marshall Plan for Central America. I think he's right. I think that regrettably he is not going to find the partners in Washington that are needed in order to make such a plan come about.
The intellectual, Noam Chomsky, just the other side of the coin, he said, hold a minute. Is perverse what we are reading or watching on television in the US, if you live in the US, because the President Trump is trying to present us that there's a national security issue here, that those migrants coming from the caravan are going to invade us, he said. And Chomsky put emphasis in saying, hold one second, many of the issues that they bring with them, we have created with our policies throughout the years in Central America. Is he right?
Well, he's right that Central America's crisis cannot be understood without reference to the dynamics of exploitation, occupation, invasion, intervention in internal conflicts in the 1970s and 80s and into the 90s of the United States. Having said that, I think that if we want to understand why is it that over the last 10 years there has been a substantial increase in the flow of families from Central America, we have to look at the dynamics of governance and of impunity inside those countries. They have to do with the political and economic elites inside those countries that, yes, have benefited from the backing and the support of the United States at various points. But the changes that are needed are not changes to US policy per se. The changes that are needed primarily are in the distribution of power within those societies. Having said that, I think there is one other thing I would add regarding Chomsky's point, that the claims that the flow of migrants, of largely women and children, to the border trying to get their cases for asylum adjudicated as American law and international norms would dictate, the notion that that is a national security threat or that it constitutes an invasion, is not about national security, and it's not about the history of the United States relations with Central America. It's fundamentally about a racist agenda from the White House directed at migrants. And the idea that you can mobilize resentment and you can mobilize fears among segments of the American electorate by referring to an invasion that is going to change our way of life or change who we collectively are. You have to understand that that is profoundly racialized and that it's a political strategy.
And mobilizing that base, is Donald Trump going to win in 2020?
I cannot honestly say that. It's too early, first of all, to say that. I can say that if the courts and important advocacy organizations that are bringing lawsuits across the country do what they should do and impede efforts to keep from the polls people who are disproportionately poor, disproportionately Latino, disproportionately Asian American or African American or Native American. That is to say, if people have the vote, I think that Donald Trump will not be able to win the presidency in 2020.
Eric Hershberg, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.